Whatever it takes, we strive for a better tomorrow. With fair elections, justice, rule of law, universal rights for all, independent media, freedom from tyranny, achieving lasting peace, to raise a voice and have a real choice, to be heard. Around the world, even in the most difficult circumstances, we see time and again that people want democracy.
Democracia.
Democracia.
Ufulu.
Ordinary people are overcoming extraordinary odds, risking everything for human rights and freedom. This cause, the cause of our time, is why the National Endowment for Democracy exists. The National Endowment for Democracy was founded in 1983 with bipartisan congressional backing as an independent, non-governmental, non-profit grant-making foundation dedicated to strengthening democracy abroad. New ideas and calls for democracy support were taking hold, paving the way for an initiative to foster a global infrastructure of democracy, for people to freely determine their own destiny.
Freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings.
NED holds a unique role as America's leading foundation for freedom. We respond to and support what citizens around the world are already championing for themselves.
You don't really know who you are until you're forced to fight for it.
Since our founding, we have stood alongside those who are on the forefront of democratic struggles everywhere. As a resource and hub for learning and intellectual exchange, NED shows up for those working for democracy. We stick around for the long term. As the challenges get tougher, we adapt, innovate, and work together in common cause to turn the tide on tyranny, to foster democratic renewal. This is the cause of our time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to our discussion on reframing security from the perspective of women living under the Taliban. Before we get started, I wanted to make a few quick announcements. First, there's a QR code at the back of the room where you can scan for additional details about this event, including panelist bios. This event will be live streamed on the NED website and social media, as well as Hashda social media platforms, which is an Afghan newspaper. There also may be printouts of the executive summary of the report that will be discussed today. And finally, for those of you who can stay after the event, we have reserved the rooftop upstairs for some networking and socializing. Unfortunately, those that are joining online, we can't receive questions online. So I did want to announce that if you are joining us online and have questions, to please email my colleague Marjan at Marjan, M-A-R-J-A-N-M, at ned.org with your questions. And then when it comes to the question and answer period, she can read those questions then. I'd like to start by introducing our keynote speaker today. We are thrilled to have with us and introduce Ms. Rina Amiri, the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights. Under the Obama administration, she served as Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ms. Amiri brings over 2 decades of political expertise, advising and working with governments in various conflict settings in West and the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and Europe. Her areas of focus are peace and security with a specialization in inclusion and mediation processes. Ms. Amiri has served in the UN in several capacities, including as senior mediation expert and a member of the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General's political team in Afghanistan during the leadership of the Bonn Agreement. She has also held senior leadership positions in a variety of universities and think tanks, including the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, Princeton University's Innovations for Social Societies, and New York University Center for Global Affairs. As a senior fellow at the Center for International Cooperation. She led the Afghanistan and Regional Policy Initiative. She has championed the rights of Afghan women and girls for decades and is a founding member of Inclusive Security, a global women's initiative advocating for the inclusion of women in peace process. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Amiri.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for being here during Women's History Month at a time that continues to be extraordinarily challenging in Afghanistan. I want to thank NET as well as ODI for their continued efforts and keeping Afghanistan in the spotlight. And I would like to thank DROPS for the extraordinarily good work that they do, that they continue to do in an environment that makes research very difficult. Your work is very important. The data-driven approach is essential. Right now, we are looking at another milestone, a tragic milestone. In a couple of days, schools will be opening up in Afghanistan. And once again, girls will not be able to participate in education in Afghanistan. It is a heartbreaking situation. It is the most extreme situation in the world for women and girls. It is a context that we have to remember. The only precedent, in fact, is the Taliban themselves. There's no precedent, there is no comparison in terms of what we see in Afghanistan. It is not something that any Muslim majority country has noted would be acceptable within the sacred tenets of Islam. It has been repudiated globally. What we have to remember is that this is not something that is just about women and girls. It is about Afghanistan. It is about the model it sets for the region and the rest of the world. What happens in Afghanistan does not just stay in Afghanistan, and we have to remember that. We also have to remember that the repercussions are not just faced by women and girls, but the entire population of Afghanistan. It has had already enormously devastating impact on an economic level. UNDP assesses that it has already cost Afghanistan over $1 billion. The fact that women and girls are kept out of education and work. It has an impact in terms of the stability of the country. Any country in which women and girls are erased is a country that creates a fertile ground for extremism and radicalization. We have to look at what is happening on human rights and the rights of women and girls as one that is of our strategic interest to address. We have to look at security in an inclusive way, as the DROPS report emphasizes. We cannot talk about an improved security situation in Afghanistan when over 50% of the population feel tremendously insecure. When you see the rights-based community, when you see minority groups, facing a level of insecurity that does not give them any type of sanctuary. They feel insecure in their homes. They feel insecure in their communities. They feel insecure any time of the day in which they are, in which they're consistently subject to scrutiny, and that has ramifications for the society at large. We have to collectively speak about the situation of women's rights and human rights in those strategic terms. It is critical from a normative perspective, but it's much more. We as who work on human rights need to change the way that we frame our discussions. And we, the diplomatic community, need to integrate women's rights and human rights in a meaningful way, and the way that we define our strategic objectives. I want to talk a little bit about what we are doing in our office to work towards those ends. One, at the diplomatic level, and every meeting that I've participated in, this is the message that I've taken. we cannot talk about security, an improved security situation in Afghanistan, when the situation continues to grow increasingly menacing for the majority of the Afghan population. And that we, as a collective community, we bear a responsibility for ensuring that when we talk to the Taliban, that we talk about women's rights and human rights in a way that they understand that this is not just simply a talking point, that this is not an issue that can be siloed or deprioritized, but that at every level we have to signify to the Taliban that they will not achieve their goals towards normalization, towards making progress on any of their objectives in a meaningful way, unless they address the demand of the Afghan population to have their rights respected. Two, I think it's absolutely critical that we collectively recognize some of the mistakes of the past. You know, anytime that a policy is made on Afghanistan without the voices of Afghans meaningfully integrated as experts, we're failing in the work that we do. And now it's even more critical because we don't have visibility in the ground. We don't have a presence on the ground. And out of the tragedy of Afghans once again being forced into exile, we have expertise in many of our countries, as well as the capacity to engage Afghans inside the country. The extraordinarily challenging situation in Afghanistan requires out-of-the-box thinking. It requires Afghans who to guide us and to lead us on how we can creatively advance policies that actually meet their interests in a way that can be meaningfully implemented. To do that, we need to identify mechanisms to bring the voices of Afghans into our policymaking. To that end, on our part, we have set up the U.S.-Afghan Consultative Mechanism, which is a mechanism to meaningfully bring in the voices of women and civil society into our policymaking. We've also encouraged other countries to do the same, and I'm encouraged now that there are a number of different platforms. The EU has a platform. The UK has put together various consultation forums, and there are many other countries that are doing the same. In fact, a couple of months ago when I organized a group of countries that were doing work to this, and there were 6 countries in addition to the EU that had set up similar platforms to bring in the voices of women in civil society. And we have said that anywhere where there's a forum in which a discussion is taking place on Afghanistan, there has to be a meaningful way of bringing Afghans to the table in that discussion, particularly women and girls. I was very heartened at the last UN convened special envoys meeting that when the Taliban demanded that the Secretary General withdraw the invitation to women in civil society for their participation, the Secretary General rejected that proposal. And women in civil society did participate, and I was also really pleased that the number of women were larger than the number of men in that meeting, and that they were able to meaningfully sit down with the special envoys and bring many of the points that have been noted in the report. And particularly, they put an emphasis on how we should be looking at the security lens in Afghanistan and why it matters to have a gendered perspective on security. 3, we need to identify how to meaningfully help Afghans inside the country through concrete efforts. Every day that these policies continue is Afghans being deprived of opportunity and of the space to actually make meaningful changes in their lives. What I hear from Afghan girls when I speak to them is that they feel that any effort that we can put in place, whether it's through support for virtual education, hybrid education, scholarships, it is essential oxygen. It engenders hope, and hope is a vital currency that we have to support. It is not sufficient to just work at a concrete level. The edicts have to be reversed, but in addition to the diplomatic work that we do, we have to identify how to provide concrete support. And one of the things that Afghans have increasingly been calling for is more accountability measures. last week at CSW, there were a number of different forums in which Afghan women leaders gathered and assembled and noted that the way that the situation in Afghanistan is being described is not fit for purpose, that there needs to be a better understanding of the tools that need to be considered, to be evaluated, and to be potentially brought to the table in terms of bringing accountability to the Taliban and recognizing the severity of the situation in a way that is meaningful, and a way that takes into account that this is the most extreme situation in the world. I want to keep my comments short. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the speakers themselves. But again, we need to remember that the Afghans that we invest in today is going to determine the Afghanistan of the future. The work that we are talking about is of a strategic imperative to all of us. Thank you very much.
To the panel section of our discussion, so I'm going to invite our panelists to join me on stage. Yeah, please go ahead. Thank you, Ms. Amiri, for that wonderful opening remarks that underscores how critical this issue is from a broader strategic perspective, and how critical it is to view security from a gendered perspective. And also for sharing your kind of key outline for how to have more tangible participation of Afghans and Afghan women and girls in these discussions. We have a wonderful panel with us today to discuss the implications of a new report by the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, DROPS, and ODI on changing social norms around age at marriage in Afghanistan. The research finds that the Taliban are deepening the drivers of early and forced marriages. Their edicts and restrictions are re-entrenching social norms that were beginning to change over the 20 years before 2021. One of these norms was growing acceptance of a higher marriage age at 18 and above. This research highlights the gendered experiences of insecurity beyond active combat, which we hope international policymakers will keep central to their deliberations around international engagement with the Taliban. To help us understand the realities of Afghan women and girls and the current international context, I'm honored to introduce this conversation with our panelists who will help us unpack this research and its implications. It's my pleasure to introduce Maryam Safi, the Executive Director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies and co-author of the report. DROPS is a research organization that was established in Afghanistan in 2014. Dr. Aisha Khan is a senior research fellow at ODI, where she focuses on gender and development and is also a co-author of the report. She's currently working on feminist movements and backlash to gender equality as it's unfolding in the global South in the context of democratic rollback and closing spaces. And finally, Dr. Nilofar Saki, who is a professional lecturer of international affairs at Elliott School at George Washington University. Nilofar is a scholar and practitioner of security and peace. With that, I think we'll kick off the conversation with Maryam, asking you to help us kind of understand what evidence your research provides about what has changed for women and girls and social norms and what that means for their security since the Taliban takeover.
Thank you very much, Amira. First, on behalf of our organization, DROPS, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to our long-term partner, the National Endowment for Democracy, for making today's event possible and always standing with their commitment to help advance the plight of Afghan women and girls. And we're truly appreciative and grateful for your efforts. And a deep gratitude to Ms. Rina Amiri for joining us today and offering those very impactful, welcoming remarks, as well as our fellow expert panelists. Thank you so much. Before I delve deeper into our study, I would like to ask our NED colleagues if they could play a short video for you to give you a glimpse into some of the key findings of this study that we conducted with ODI. Thank you. As you've just witnessed, our research shows quite an alarming trend where families are increasingly marrying off their daughters as the next best thing following the ban on education. With the ban on education, this has basically stripped away girls from delaying marriage and using that as a reason for marriage later, saying, oh, when I finish my studies, and then families were tending to agree. Hence, we saw a slight decrease in the last 20 years during the Republic when it came to the issues of forced and early child marriage. Then there's also the component of employment. And families in particular, where there's more than one daughter, and now they no longer can work and contribute to the income of the household, families, because of the poverty and humanitarian crisis, are now more inclined to marry off their daughters as soon as they could. And lastly, in terms of mobility, when women can only leave their homes with a mahram, then that becomes a pushing factor for families to marry their daughters off forcefully at times, meaning by force, I mean their decisions are not taken into, their choice is not taken into consideration. Now, the general sense of insecurity in the country is both physical and it's livelihood insecurity. And these are all the components that kind of encapsulate this, the reasonings behind why we see early forced marriages of girls. And another shocking finding is that families are using marriage as a form to protect their girls from forced marriages to the Taliban. Now, when we were doing our focus groups, we found two types of cases. One is the scenario where Taliban are using intimidation tactics and are pursuing girls. At times, like you saw with the focus group quote, women that are engaged. And other times, they're using local religious scholars in villages and in districts to identify households that have daughters that are not married as of yet, and they may be above the age of 16 and above, or widows. And then that gets reported back to the Taliban in what we hear, and then those homes get approached. And so there is both an actual threat, but then there's also the perceived notion of threat. One thing that all of my Afghan colleagues here will understand is this common sentence that was articulated to us in the focus groups. Alat kharabas. Alat kharabas. Meaning the situation is bad. And so that also is one of those key drivers. But lastly, despite this incredibly dire and harrowing situation, our focus group respondents were still able to identify some small but meaningful acts of resistance to the everyday, to the Taliban's gender persecution. And we have an entire chapter on resistance, which I think is quite fascinating. I urge you to take a look at it, where they report a mosaic of low-level clandestine activities that bring hope and also resist oppression, centered on whether it's online education, income generation within the home, and also solidarity networks at the very, very local level, and it could be a bit of at the macro level as well, that continues to support them in resisting what they see and what they're faced with on an everyday basis.
Thanks, Mariam. Aisha, as the co-author of this report, can you elaborate a little bit more on where you see the Taliban's gender persecution fitting into kind of broader backsliding on women's rights globally?
Thank you. That's an important question because when I met Mariam at ODI and we were thinking about how to work together, I thought that the story of what's happening with women and girls in Afghanistan is not just a story of that particular country's very troubled and difficult history, but it's a story that fits into the global narrative around the backlash against gender equality that we're experiencing. And all over the world, countries are contending with backlash, but in different ways, because every country has its own trajectory, its own history of struggles with issues around gender equality and inclusion. But I felt it was really important to highlight what is happening right now and amplify the voices of women from inside Afghanistan in order to warn the world that this rollback of gender justice and the rights that have been gained are perhaps the most egregious example of backlash that we see in the world today, but it could be, it could foretell a very dark future for the rest of us if we don't address this in the best possible way. So it's not an outlier. It is a story of how the Muslim world has struggled with its own politics around democratic inclusion and religion, and how women fit into the story of unfolding and building nation states under very challenging circumstances. So the way in which we handle Afghanistan is a really important struggle for particularly countries in the Muslim world. So secondly, the way this story also links with anti-rights movements is that the research on anti-rights and backlash is increasingly discovering, of course, and unfolding the financial trails and the money and the politics that have been going into building the anti-gender equality policy moves around the world, led from, of course, partly in Western Europe, Russia, and the United States, but less attention has been drawn to how the Muslim world has been funding its own anti-gender equality work for decades. And I thought that the story of the Taliban actually fits into that much more significantly. Therefore, the challenge is how to deal with the rise of religion in public and political life in Muslim countries, in South Asia, in Afghanistan, because these are questions that we wrestle with, but to resolve those questions means also resolving how we are going to deal with the role of women in public life, and how do we ensure women's voices if we are actually demanding inclusive participatory democracies. So yeah, this is just in short why I felt this was a very important research study. And finally, just to close, to frame our evidence or to base our evidence always on the centrality of women's voices, rather than other voices stepping in saying, no, this is what we want, what women should want, or how to include women. It was really important for Mariam and I to work together to collect data that is only based on the perspective of women and the real life experience that they're having as a story of backlash, and how backlash and anti-democratic forces work together in the most extreme circumstances.
Thank you. Nilufar, I'll turn to you and would love to hear your thoughts on what you see as the implications of this study and research on reframing security from a gendered perspective.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Amira, and thank you, Ned, for having me in this very important discussion. Well, first of all, well done for the report. There's an amazing report. I was going through the report. I found first about some technical aspect I wanted to mention here, which is extremely needed in today's field of research. I mean, the method, the data collection method that you adopted, this snowball sampling and focus group, I think that was very relevant to the context and the current context, and that made representative the report. Though the report was, the research was conducted in 11 provinces, but in 4 zones of Afghanistan, that snowball sampling of findings, people with similar characteristics, I think that made it very representative. And the focus group, I think that made the discussion, when I was going through all the interviews, the focus group made the discussion very focused. So I think that was, the effectiveness of this and the representation of the population, which you can see from the report. And from technical perspective. Well, I saw the report from security lens, and I wanted to see how I actually read twice the interviews and the results of the interviews, both the analytical component of it and then the people direct quotes. What I found in that is there are two, as Mariam John mentioned, there is a perceived notion of insecurity and actual insecurity. The perceived notion of insecurity is overall associated with who is in power. The group which is in power, that is brings instability. I mean, the characteristics of that, the regime in power, that itself bring kind of instability to the eyes of the people, particularly women, in terms of what they will do and how they will react, and overall the nature of the regime itself. That is kind of a created perceived insecurity. What I analyzed out of the some other interviews, that there are also actual insecurities, and actual insecurity is caused by of course, whatever is happening in terms of detention, intimidation, suppression, operation by the leading group, and also the decrees. The decrees also created an actual insecurity in women's life, and that is those decrees are kind of policy. They are, and I'm scared that if this will continue, that will be normalized as the norm is mentioned a lot in the report. And I remember in 2002 when we started, and actually it is sad that we are starting everything from scratch, because in 2002 I remember we were going to different villages of the Western region with one of the program I started at that point. And we were trying to find out those norms, unwanted norms that impacted women's life. And it's unfortunate that we are starting everything from scratch in Afghanistan context. So yeah, the perceived and actual notion of insecurity, that was an important element. I think that we need to really talk a lot about it, from both from general population's view and lens, and also in particular from women. The other word which I found a lot repeated in the report, which is quite so much is linked with the insecurity, with the whole definition of insecurity, is fear. The word fear has been used a lot by the respondents, and also in the analytical component, you see the fear. Fear is the root of insecurity. Fear actually is the indicator of insecurity. Fear of being killed, fear of being detained, fear of losing someone, losing your loved ones. So that word fear is used a lot. So therefore, the context gets so clear from the interviews, the context of insecurity, which is insecure. Maybe the armed conflict has reduced because, of course, the party in armed conflict is in power right now. Maybe that component has reduced. That's not all a bet. We don't have really concrete reports. But overall, if we seek security from a comprehensive lens, an intersectional lens, the nature of security evolved after the Taliban takeover. And these are the indicators that women highlighted. These are the indicators that analyzed in this report, that we can clearly define that the nature of insecurity have changed. And this insecurity, as it was highlighted by Special Envoy Amiri, that they are the causes of radicalization. They will be the causes of we don't know. I mean, at some point, armed conflict, if we will link all the pieces together. So yes, from the reports, from the interviews, it gets very obvious. The security landscape very obvious. The wording used by the interviewees, and each word indicate either the root cause of insecurity or the indicator of insecurity. So I'm glad that this discussion is coming up, reframing security, because that's exactly what Afghanistan needs at this point. The nature of security has evolved, and I'm glad organizations like NED and others put forward this whole concept. I hope this discourse will continue with more data-driven information, that from Afghanistan, how people define insecurity and how they feel protected in their communities or under such regime. I think that would help donors, that would help policymakers in order to develop concrete policies based on what people need, or overall based on what has to be changed both at the top and the bottom. I stop there.
Thank you. Speaking of data-driven research, DROPS through Bishnau has been surveying Afghan women across 26 provinces for many years now. Mariam, do you have any final observations or reflections on how this data compares to past findings from your work through Bishnau?
Well, for us, interestingly, what we find in every single data collection phase, and our data collection phases are bi-monthly. We conduct telesurveys, face-to-face surveys, and focus group discussions on a bi-monthly basis through our Bishnau initiative. And we make this data available to everyone on Bishnau's website. And when we've done we've surveyed a little over, since the fall of the Republic, we've surveyed a little over 30,000 women on different topics: humanitarian aid, security, prioritization of needs, political participation, sanctions, gender apartheid, mental health. And in each one, you see a common thread. And that common thread is what Dr. Sakhi just mentioned, being that component of fear. Now, I can give you an example of this, especially when we did our survey with mental health, which was in March of last year. For Afghan women, when we've asked them how they define security, they do not define security through the traditional lens of security. The way they define their security is whether they have psychological security, do they have emotional security, do they have mental security, and that is something that they are quite vocal about that they do not have. So for them, they don't feel secure. They don't feel secure inside of their homes, and let alone outside. Now, when we asked them about traditional security, and we did this survey in in July of 2022, 36% of women reported feeling a degree of unsafety when going out in public. Now, when we asked them if they felt that the security, traditional security in their provinces had improved, 43.7% said yes. So they were quite honest. Yes, physical security in terms of bombs and IEDs and attacks had decreased, of course, because the perpetrators are no longer committing those crimes. However, when you go into the focus groups where we started asking them and probing deeper into how they look at security, how they define security, the majority of our focus group participants contradicted these statistics. And so what they said was they argued that traditional security was improving somewhat, but argued that statistics hide a grimmer reality and the atmosphere that is shrouded with uncertainty and fear. They said that they do not have any mental or emotional sense of security inside or outside. And so even when we did our study on early and forced and child marriage, we found that insecurity was a major driving factor. And so this brings us to a very clear and concrete conclusion that women's key priority continues to be their rights. And this is a constant theme, no matter what survey we've done. And you can see these for yourself. And so for them, women's rights are above access to humanitarian aid and above reducing poverty and above traditional security. And so this becomes clear that for Afghan women, their sense of security and their reality of security is tied with their rights, period. So if you take away their rights and their freedoms, you've taken away their sense of security. And it kind of surprises me that we are trying to convince certain stakeholders that women feel insecure because they don't have rights, and that at this time in our trajectory, they are still equating security with traditional security, and so it becomes it's quite a frustrating a cycle to be in, and I don't think it's that hard to understand or believe. And so if there's one thing I like to leave you with today is that Afghan women's sense of security is tied to their rights, and those rights being protected, period.
Thank you. Aisha, Mariam talked about kind of the impact of this democratic rollback in Afghanistan on women there. You previously talked about this global democratic rollback, and what is your kind of what are some of the trends or similarities that you're seeing from the impact on women in Afghanistan with the impact of this democratic rollback more globally?
Well, one feature of the de-democratization that is happening globally is, as I mentioned earlier, the greater infusion of religion in public life and religion in, of course, policymaking and political discourse and rhetoric, which has a very gendered interpretation when it comes to the rights of women. Another is that the rise in authoritarianism is also bringing with it a rise in patriarchal values and highly misogynistic political discourse. You hear, of course, in the Western world about preservation of family values, traditional roles for women, and that is upheld as an ideal. But if you look at it if you zoom back and look at it from an understanding of democratic spaces, you see that this is actually a discourse that is trying to push women back into the public domain and private domain and remove them from the public domain. And what the Taliban have done is, in effect, put that into brute force and said women actually can't leave the home, basically, and they cannot engage in public life. So that is the most extreme example of what politicians in other parts of the world are trying to kind of more insidiously bring about, but it's a return of women to the private domain, and it's an idea that women belong best in their roles, in their social reproductive roles. So that is one warning sign to consider. Another is that part of the rise in authoritarianism and the rollback of democracy involves shrinking civic space. And in shrinking civic space, silencing media, silencing the ability of civil society to advocate for governments to be more transparent and accountable, it also silences feminist movements and the ability of women to get together and act collectively in order to advance their rights, not only in the global South, but of course in the West as well. Now you see in Afghanistan, the pushback of women from all public spaces, whether it was, when there was a slight democratic opening, there was a quota for women in the legislative assembly, suddenly women were able to advance in public life in unprecedented ways. The shutdown of those spaces has also disallowed women from engaging in collective action. So when women cannot engage in public space and collective action, how can they advocate for their rights, especially from an unaccountable regime? So these are examples of how you have to understand democratic processes and link what is happening in Afghanistan with what is more broadly happening globally.
If I may ask just a follow-up question, because we've seen in some parts of at least the region that I cover, the Middle East and North Africa, that you've had authoritarian resurgence that seem to have ousted Islamist-leaning political, Islamist-leaning governments and replace them with a seemingly secular government and have women in token roles. And I'm curious kind of your assessment of that as the other side of, you talked about the challenge with religion and the role of women in public life, but also the challenge of authoritarianism on this front.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious your thoughts on kind of these token spaces for women in those types of regions.
And that's really important to understand that every country has its own specific trajectory and struggles with democracy, with religion in public life, and with how to deal with women's rights. And it's very, it's weak to generalize globally. It's even weaker to even talk about the global South or the Muslim world as if they're all following one trajectory. But the struggles that Egypt, for example, has taken with respect to gender equality, secular politics, Muslim Brotherhood, are instructive for the rest of us, especially in countries that are dealing with similar dynamics. So it's not that I don't want to generalize about authoritarianism, because it obviously does not always have a specific anti-gender component, but where it does and where authoritarianism is in any form in place, civic space shrinks. And when civic space shrinks, it's very difficult for women to advocate for their rights. And certainly even countries that are not specifically anti-gender in their authoritarianism are certainly not, shall we say, trendsetters when it comes to gender equality either.
Nilüfer, given what we've discussed about gender insecurity, what, in your opinion, does that mean for global engagement with the Taliban?
Well, that's a good question. I think I'll go back to what Dr. Aisha said about the whole nature of authoritative system, especially if it's also based on some ideology, not only a political ideology, but a religious ideology based on a specific interpretation. That makes things difficult to change. And especially we have seen in terms of Taliban from the last 2.5 years that even one of the demands that everyone had, international community and the regional countries and OIC and everyone, that was opening of schools. And that hasn't happened from last 2.5 years because that is really a very strict and extreme ideologist group. So that makes things difficult. I mean, that makes changes difficult in such a system when ideology rules and ideology decides about policies. And we have seen in terms of the current regime in Afghanistan. So I think what international community can do in such a, with very limited options, to be honest, with very less opportunities of change, especially now with the recent Doha conference, Doha meeting, we have seen Taliban did not show up even. So there is a lack of appetite, lack of willingness from the other party to be involved in change. Whatever change processes, either it would be Doha or UN or DC or London, they want to propose, I think there is less appetite from that end. So in such condition, I think what I would see is people-centric approach. Focus on the, I think Dr. Aisha also mentioned about the closing and shutting down of the civic space. That has to be focused, more forces or progressive forces from Afghanistan, from different sectors, has to be identified, work with them, empower them, even if education would remain, I'm not so much for the online education for women because I do receive calls from women who are right now at home and they cannot go out. And they share their frustration that they feel locked, they feel imprisoned. It impacted their psychology overall, and some of them, they want to just leave because of all this, the feeling of being imprisoned. They're working from home, but the feeling of being imprisoned. So that's why the online packages for the long term is not gonna help women. I mean, women should go out, they should work outside, and there should be open space for them. So in such situation, even though, again, I'm against of long-term continuation of online packages, but it's good that education packages for women should continue. Civil society should be empowered, either if it's through humanitarian packages. Most of the civil society in Afghanistan, they have shift their strategy from security, rights, or whatever they used to work, development, governance, to humanitarian. They are there. They were working in different other sectors, but now Taliban have forced them to work only on one particular strategy, which is mostly humanitarian. So the economic development and all the governance and peace and security, they have taken really a back seat. Therefore, but they are there, the bases are there, so it's good to work with them. Civil society should be mobilized, should be empowered, should be supported. I mean, the doors should not be closed on them from international community. And through either technical support, kind support, or exposure, the civil society should, most of the civil society are out actually, but civil society meant the people who empowered from last 20 years. But the new people are ready to step in, to take in those roles, and those has to be empowered. In Afghanistan, in the remote areas, I think one of the drawbacks of the Republic time was there was less focus on the remote areas. By the remote areas means 50 minutes drive from the center of town. So because of so much technical reasons, those places were deprived of certain assistance. So this is based on lesson learned. It's good to focus on the remote areas too for change. Target them, work with them, either they are elders, religious leaders, whoever. They are part of civil society. So civil society shouldn't be confined to only NGOs. It's a broader area in Afghanistan that councils come under there, elders of communities come under that. The other small entities and working groups are there who work with the organization. They are part of those. So those should be supported. And women groups, most of them are working in hiddenly or secret. They have secret bases. At least those should be supported at this time when we see less opportunity for a very systematic change. I think those people-centric approach, either through humanitarian aid, but empowering them, working with them, or through other educational packages should be the way forward.
And if I can just ask a follow-up question, aside from kind of working and empowering civil society, as the international community is engaged on Afghanistan, are there specific leverage points that you think could be effective in terms of addressing issues of gender persecution with the Taliban?
Well, the engagement has been there with the Taliban from 2.5 years. So engagement is not really a new issue. It was from day one, for a high-level engagement were with them. But unfortunately, no concrete outcome on women's, if we're talking specifically on women's rights issues. So I think that should be, some of the support to the current authorities should be conditional. Whatever support this cash or kind is going to them, that should be conditional, particularly on issues of women's rights. For example, the girls' education should be one of the major negotiation topic at the table of negotiations. And that has to be negotiated with any kind of support which is provided to the regime. And that conditional support, especially in terms of women's rights, we haven't seen happened. And support has been given to the current regime without putting that particular point into serious consideration. So there should be that serious conditional engagement with the Taliban on issues of women and girls' education.
Thank you. Mariam, the report you produced had a number of recommendations. Could you summarize a couple of the key recommendations that you've identified?
Sure. Well, three that I'd like to reiterate here is one that's really along the lines of what Dr. Sakhi just mentioned, is that international actors must keep the interests of women and girls central to the negotiation process with the Taliban, including ensuring women have a place at the negotiation table. Now, what that means is it doesn't mean that you consult only before or after or on the side, but that you do all that. And you have to ensure that you've got women and civil society actors, women-led organizations present at the table when these talks are happening. When the UN Secretary General dismissed the demands of the Taliban by saying that we should be the only representatives of Afghans here and not the group of civil society that you have brought in, him saying no to that was probably one of the strongest actions I had seen the UN leadership take in years, really. And I think that it's really important that that continues. And now that we're looking at the next Doha meeting coming up, I hope that in the pursuit of trying to bring the Taliban to the table, that civil society and women human rights defenders won't become a side dialogue in this process, that they will be in the process like they were in Doha, and perhaps even more constructively coming this time around. Secondly, maintaining girls' education is a central resistance strategy to early and forced and child marriage. That's quite simple. And what I mean by this is that it builds the agency, the daughter's agency in voice and decision-making about their future. Now, as mentioned earlier, online education is playing a really central role right now when we don't have schools opening, but it is not a replacement for a formal education system, and it can never become. And second of all, if tomorrow the Taliban announce that they are not opening schools, but they're opening madrasas all over the country, and girls can go to the madrasas, that too is not a replacement for a formal education system. So I hope that there are no sort of really trigger-happy stakeholders here and thinking, oh, well, great, we've got madrasas open, so we've got one goal has been met. No, it's far from it, to be honest. Formal education needs to be open for boys and girls. That's it. And I think we need to maintain, be very steadfast and committed to this. And lastly, speaking specifically on the norms element of resistance, based on our conversations in the focus groups, it was mentioned that community-based groups should be funded to facilitate dialogue and discussion within families to support the alignment of marriage practices with positive change in individual beliefs about marriage norms. And so the household, the community can continue to play a positive role in that process, and this should be encouraged and facilitated. But if you look at the recommendations, we start from very macro level and we go micro. You need both. At times I see stakeholders taking the approach of the more micro level. Let's pragmatic, practical, who can we fund and how can we support this? And that's all great. And as Dr. Sakhi mentioned, it's important. But unless you have the more structural conversations happening at this level, such as for example, these Doha events and other multilateral spaces, you're never going to have substantive change on the ground. And you're just going to continue to go in circles, and nothing will really change. You're just, as I mentioned at CSW a week ago, it's just a Band-Aid, and that's all you're doing is you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. So we have to be cognitive of that.
Okay, thank you. Aisha, Mariam talked about how encouraging or requiring the continuation of education is critical for curtailing early marriages. Is there anything else the international community can do to support families and girls to reduce the drivers of child and early and forced marriages in Afghanistan?
So actually, this is a political question. Because the international community has a broader political problem on its hands about how to handle the Taliban and engage or not engage with it and address the regime as it stands, and how to do this by ensuring that they still have some key leverage with the Taliban so that they can get concessions on things like the way they treat women. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question at all, and I don't think the international community has figured it out. But there is one point I would just like to make in the conversations I've had with other representatives of other governments that are dealing with backlash in their countries. They're finding that increasingly they're having to instrumentalize the work that they do abroad as development actors. Rather than support women's rights per se, they're having to instrumentalize their engagement and say, no, actually, we should do sexual and reproductive health programming because it's good for national development and we'll show you how. How. And education is good because it improves your, growth and economic growth and so on and so forth. I think that I would caution that the instrumentalization of women's gender and development is a slippery slope. And I think that the international community does need to take a firmer stand, as Mariam was mentioning. When they do, it could potentially be effective. And finally, just a comment about Muslim states. Is it possible that they could more robustly contest the Islam that the Taliban are implementing? I don't know if that area of leverage has been explored as efficiently as it could have been, to say that, is this really the Islam that we want the Muslim world to be recognized as implementing globally? And are there not competing interpretations of how women can be treated under even Islamic dispensations? I don't know if there's any easy answers to this, but these are some questions that need to be engaged with seriously.
Thank you. And then a final question for Nilüfer. We talked about this a little bit in the last round of questions, but as it seems that members of the international community are getting closer to potentially recognizing the regime in Afghanistan. What recommendations do you have for the international community as they kind of explore or weigh those options?
Well, I first think recognition shouldn't be at the table at this point. Well, Taliban, it's time for evaluating what Taliban have done and what Taliban have whatever they committed, they have met all those commitments or no. So I think recognition shouldn't be at the table. This is not the time for that. The time should be to evaluate the last 2.5 years of engagement for the international community. And then they should have a thematic focus. The international community, for example, on security, what has been achieved, on women's rights, what have been achieved. On, for example, corruption, that Taliban do claim that they reduce corruption, but again, there was no money. So we have to find the indicators of that. So I think there should be some more data. I would say more research has to be conducted at this point for all this thematic focus in terms of what has been done. Of course, governance and all other related issues come up. So recognition shouldn't be at the table. The second is that the discourse should continue. As Dr. Aisha mentioned, we see a less appetite from the international community also at this point. There are lots happening in the world politically. In the region, there's a lot happening. So there is less focus on Afghanistan, unfortunately. So I would like to see more discourse happening I'm glad UN is doing a lot of work, that work right now. The international community organizations, humanitarian organizations, they should keep the discourse. They should keep alive the cause of Afghanistan. I think that is by itself is a big contribution to the future of Afghanistan. Not let die the cause, not let die the discussion that everything is settled and everything is rosy there, and let's stop that. I was actually very happy with Ned bringing that reframing security, because one of my critique has been that, well, nobody's talking about security anymore about Afghanistan. Everybody thinks that, well, everything is now good, then there's no security crisis, nobody is being killed on the street, so let's not talk about security. But that's not true, actually. I'm glad that Ned has brought this up, because that's exactly what I've been talking about, that we have to bring security at the discourse and talk about the changing nature of security. There are security crises, but the nature has changed. So all these points at this point, this thematic issues needs focused discourse, because we have completely new system in place, and new landscape is there, new security landscape, humanitarian landscape. So that all has to be discussed. Data should support some of the argument, and that's the time for all those. I don't see really a very dramatic, concrete change at this point. And I don't see there is an appetite from international community for any dramatic change in Afghanistan at this point. But these pieces of work may lead to a change in future, whatever change we want to see that may lead. So this discourse, continuation of discourse, data to support the argument, and keeping the cause alive, the Afghanistan cause alive, that is where international community can contribute a lot at this point.
Great, thank you all very much. I now want to turn to our audience, both in the room and online. Unfortunately, online there's no space to ask questions, but if you're joining us online and have questions, please email my colleague Marjan Mateen, Marjan, M-A-R-J-A-N-M, @NED if you have any questions. So now we'll just take a few questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for this discussion. The opening speaker mentioned that women's rights and human rights need to be integrated better, and efforts need to be made to not silo or deprioritize women's rights. Do any of the presenters on the panel have any ideas of how to do that better? How to integrate better women's rights with human rights and make efforts so that women's rights are not deprioritized?
Let's see if are there any more questions, so we can take a few at a time.
Thank you very much for this report and also for this discussion. I have two questions. First of all, I see these Western feminist movements or mainstream here. They see the women's issue in Afghanistan as a third world issue. Unfortunately, the efforts here are not in line so much with the changes in Afghanistan for the women's situation. How we could see that change happen? That the meso level Mariam mentioned, we need that. We don't need Afghan women just shout for themselves, and people here, they see like, okay, Afghan women, that's their issue. We need that, collaboration between feminists in Afghanistan, from Afghanistan, and also feminists from here. How we can see that change happen. And strongly, we see feminists here that we should make change. We should, take action against that gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Second, when we see the rise of authoritarian regimes and these regimes using religion or misinterpreting religion for their gains and strategies and policies, what are the roles of democratic world to strengthen them instead of, shrinking them or removing them? Thank you.
I think we had another question here as well.
Thank you. Following to the question that she has, as a feminist, how can the voice of Afghan women how can we as the outside women from outside of Afghanistan can help and see what their sufferings. Now, obviously, we can see it in the news and everything, but how can we be able to speak for them as far as their rights? Because you mentioned earlier that that's the biggest issue, how their rights are not being established and heard. So how can we do it for them? Thank you.
Zach? She's waiting patiently. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, please give the mic to the Afghans. That's what I would say. That's how you support. Give the spaces to the Afghans. My question is for any of you, maybe Mariam John. Ms. Amiri mentioned the committees or the forums that exist of Afghan experts. Can you maybe perhaps tell whoever is interested here how to put these expertise on the right tables, so that the coordination of these committees is extremely important in order to create the spaces that the Afghans need to bring those voices. The legitimate spaces that are there needs to be filled with the Afghans. So this process has to be Afghan owned. Maybe you can talk about that and see how a coordination mechanism that is needed for that. Thank you.
Zach, I think we have 4 questions, so let's start and give each panelist a few minutes to respond to those, and then we can take another round of questions. Mariam.
Oh, thank you. In terms of, let me start with your question. In terms of coordination, I think that the mechanism that Ms. Amiri talked about that has been set up here, that mechanism is something that is implemented elsewhere as well, and it actually works pretty well in the sense that what is happening here is identifying various, I mean, we've got expertise in all categories. So identifying categories or working groups of experts, and then connecting with all the relevant policymaking institutions within a capital. And then whenever that capital needs to consult, when that institution needs to consult on a particular topic, let's say it's rule of law, or if it's governance, or it's women's rights, then what they do is they consult with you to bring in, to connect from inside of Afghanistan, a few experts to speak directly with that institution. And I hear that that's happening quite regularly here through that mechanism, and I think that's really fantastic. Now, yes, we've got a lot of various forums that have established, both here as well as in Europe. And as of right now, we don't have a coordination mechanism that can bring all of these forums together, so we can consolidate or strengthen our efforts. And developing such a mechanism to do so would not be any easy endeavor. It would be a challenging one, but I believe that there is a process underway to try to connect them. So when we see something happening at the UN, or we see something happening at another multilateral level, and advocacy organizations are drawing up letters, they're drawing up petitions. You normally have numerous petitions and letters coming out, which are still very good. But consolidating that and bringing that into one document is quite powerful. And so I believe that various women's rights organizations are working on creating a coordination mechanism that can sort of bring all of this together. In terms of prioritizing women's rights, well, the way that we do it at Drops, I'll speak for myself, the way we try to do it is we've taken the route of gathering data where we saw a very deep gap. So we gather data from women, women's perspectives, as I mentioned, in the thousands, regularly. And then we put these perspectives into policy briefs that are absorbable by policymakers, short and quick and what it is that they need. And then we try to channel them to all the correct institutions and all of the key capitals that are currently working on Afghanistan. And how we do this is we try to time it with something important that is taking place. Whether it's UNGA, or whether it's the Doha event, or whether it is the review of UNAMA's mandate at the UN, or whatnot. So we try to make sure that we get it to policymakers before they go into those meetings in the hopes that it informs their decision making. It's still it's a struggle. It's a struggle because we talk about local ownership, but local ownership still is treated very rhetorically. And it's all over the place. And we saw it with the state building and peace building mission in Afghanistan. So it's really still an uphill battle. We talk about inclusivity, but it's just rhetorical, really. So unless you leverage it where it becomes a prerogative they cannot ignore, at times it is sidelined. For example, in the Doha event and the assessment, the independent assessment on Afghanistan, it prioritized counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics, and counterterrorism, way above human rights and women's rights. It really did. Then it did put a caveat in there, which was thanks to actually all the advocacy that Afghan women inside and outside were doing, that unless the Taliban uphold and respect Afghanistan's obligations under international law, there could never be recognition. But I would say that was one of the examples of advocacy really proving itself. But that's some example of how we do it at our organization.
Yeah, just a quick comment, which is that I think that what happens in other countries serves as the best model for how to sustain a commitment to human rights, and within that, women's rights, and how democracy can effectively decide the extent to which it wants to engage with religion in public life. And what's happened is that because the UN, as the standard bearer for human rights, has become so disempowered and under attack globally, and as Western democracies are struggling with their own rollback of the power of democratic participatory democracies, that portends very badly for countries that are struggling to democratize. So really the best way to help a struggling country like Afghanistan move in the direction of upholding human rights and developing democracy is to ensure that it's taking place in your own home, because that, and also ensure that the UN retains power and credibility and authoritativeness, not to let its moral authority be eroded, because what happens on one side of the world affects what happens in the other. So the rise of a certain kind of misogynist politics in the West is very bad for the rest of us in other countries.
There was a question about how to prioritize women's rights and how to make change, and why things are not producing end result, I think, what I understood from the question. If you look at the history of women's movement in Afghanistan from 1920 till now, we see where the problem is. I think that should give us a real problem. For me, when I did a research way back in 2005, and that was TrueNet actually, where I look at from 1920 till the 2002-3, I saw all the nature of the systems and governments, and then what was the major cause of why women's conditions still in Afghanistan remain the same and why nothing has changed. One of the major findings of my research at that time, which I think resonates quite well to the current time, is that the frequent collapse of systems and frequent collapse of government. And we see from last 20 years, at least the history of last 20 years is in front of us. I started on these issues at the end of 2001. And we started all the things that we are discussing now, we actually started talking about all those stuff in 2002, 2003. And it took us 20 years to at least institutionalize some stuff. To change some unwanted norms. I remember I was going to the village in Badqis and Khor to launch literacy classes for girls. It was soon after the first regime of the Taliban. And then the elders, they wouldn't allow, the male members wouldn't allow their girls to go to school and to let us go. And we worked with them for 3, 4, 5 years consecutively, sensitizing men first, in order to allow us to let women go to the adult women and also girls go to education, those remote areas in the villages and provinces. And then after 5, 6 years, when I was back in the same provinces and the same villages, you could see the changes. I mean, those elders, those male members, they created their own literacy packages. And they sustained it. So it took many of those actors, international community, the funding, the current time authority, everyone, to put all those efforts for some change. Those are very small changes, but lots and lots of challenges, believe me. But at least those were hopes for many of us who were working. So then what happened after 20 years, with few steps taken, everything went back. The same you would see from 1920 and every 10, 20 years, the same change happened. A little bit of change and then few steps back in terms of women's rights. A few steps forward and then a drawback. So I think that is one of the major causes of why women's issue or why women women issue overall doesn't get institutionalized first, and why the norms are not changing. For example, in the report, there's a lot about norms. What worries me, what concerns me is this decrease. If it remains decrease for a long time, they will be institutionalized norms. And then the women themselves will oppose change. That was concerned me in such a context. Because that exactly, we had these experiences in 2002 and 2003, because some women even were not letting us to proceed further with some of our women's rights programs, because they were saying, well, they were against the culture, they're against our religious belief and all. And it took us a while to change at least and modify some of those perceptions. And now the same thing starts from the scratch, and this decrease will change the people's perception about themselves. The women about their own agency. Women will start believing, if this decrease will continue, that they are made to be confined at home. And that's their role, the social productive role that Dr. Aisha was mentioning. That's actually what they have to do. The rest is not their area to touch. So that institutionalized norms is dangerous for society and will not allow women to move forward. That will further radicalize the society and will undermine the agency of women further and further. And that is where, going back to your question, I think, and that the continuous collapse of government system and then going back and forth, that did not let women empowerment to happen in society. And that's actually one of the drawbacks.
We have time for another round of questions, and we have a hand raised here.
Thank you so much. Two quick questions. First one for Mariam Safi. You mentioned that you saw that the UN leadership, you sort of praised the UN leadership for making this decision of not making this concession to the Taliban, but you also said that was actually one of the strongest signals you saw in years. What does that say about the UN in general, and should we also speak about, let's say, a certain failure of international organizations when it comes to women's rights? And the second question for Aisha Khan, you mentioned in a side note almost the instrumentalization of sort of women's rights in the humanitarian aid and development space. Maybe you can just give us one or two more sentences on that. I find that very interesting and worrying as well. Thank you.
There's another question in the back here.
Hi, Sadiq Amini from ORF America. First, I start with a hope. I hope that the global community of women see the situation in Afghanistan not like a situation of women in Afghanistan. It's a global situation for women, because women are fundamentally women first before being Afghan or American or anything else, the same way that men are. Any problem that men or women face anywhere in the world is particularly to their gender. Imagine if the table was reversed, 20 million men being imprisoned by women somewhere, no man would have called this as national security issues or national interest, and they would be engaging, they would be talking, there would be bombards, there would be action. And so I hope everybody sees that in that context. And so that leads me to the question that, authoritarian regimes support authoritarian regimes. The Taliban came in power because authoritarian regimes were supporting them. And so what makes me wonder is why would then the democracies come into this game and be facilitative or act in a way that continues to allow this authoritarian regime, the worst type of authoritarian regime, which is also ideological, which is also religious, to breathe? Why are democracies allowing this? Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Marjan, do we have anything from email? Okay, so final questions.
Well, in terms of the question about the UN, well, I mean, I think I said it when I mentioned that was the hardest stance they had taken since August of 2021. And it's true. The UN in my opinion, has till date, it has failed the women of Afghanistan, as well as those of minority groups in Afghanistan as well. And we've seen this time and again. So many examples I could give you, starting from humanitarian aid initially, when the idea for when after August 2021, the immediate reaction was, okay, we have to get humanitarian aid to Afghanistan because there's going to be an utter collapse and chaos. And it's true, there was a humanitarian crisis and we did needed those funds. But in the pursuit of humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, you also saw, agencies within the UN prioritizing humanitarian aid, and us arguing for principled humanitarian aid, being told there's no such thing as principled humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is just humanitarian aid, and it goes to everybody when it's required. And then we saw a year later when the Taliban announced an edict that women could no longer work for both local NGOs, INGOs, as well as the UN. Now, that edict and that statement preventing women from working with the UN was a direct violation of the UN Charter. And when that happens, normally the UN will leave a country, because now you are targeting its own staff and its own charter for the work that it's doing in that country. And I was so surprised to see that the UN, especially the humanitarian aid agencies, respond by saying, okay, their female staff stayed at home. They continued to get their salaries, I believe, but they were able to stay at home. And humanitarian aid agencies within the UN system then started to work to justify that having women stay at home did not have an impact on the delivery of humanitarian aid. They tried to build stats and hire consultancy agencies to go and do interviews and surveys and I don't know what, to prove that it's not making an impact, so it's okay, we can continue like this. Whereas we were doing surveys on this specific topic, and we asked women that if this ban had made any impact on the delivery of humanitarian aid. And they said yes, particularly to female-headed households. And then when we asked them what were some of the impacts that this was happening, one of the gravest impacts of this was the exploitation of the delivery of this aid to women in Afghanistan, because now only men were delivering aid to women in Afghanistan. So there is a dynamics of power that shifts here. And so that was quite alarming. So yes, the UN has failed terribly.
So
regard.
we just got the 1 minute warning.
I know, I
Can
saw
we have
that.
just a few more minutes for everyone? So just a few more minutes, and I'm going to add one more question to the pile since we have very little time. But if there's any final takeaways, calls to action as a result of this discussion,
yes.
Miriam, you want to?
There was actually one other question. I think our colleague from RF, in terms of totalitarian, work with totalitarian to to give space to a totalitarian regime to come up, and why are democracies getting engaged? I don't believe that the totalitarian governments brought about another totalitarian government. I believe that liberal democracies, in addition with totalitarian states, carved the space for the Taliban regime to come to power. I mean, who was negotiating with the Taliban? It was Ambassador Khalilzad, as far as I remember, and the key strategic partnership of the Afghan state, and then the key partner of the Taliban during those talks were the United States, the Western world. So no, I think it was just about everybody in the multilateral institution, the P5, and so it's a mix. And I think that there is this thought under the liberal peace agenda that, from when it was written till now, I think it continues to bear so much weight, that liberal democracies will easily justify illiberal means in the hopes to have liberal pursuits or goals attained at the end. And I think this is one of those processes that went haywire. Now, I don't know what the long-term idea of it was, but let's not mistake liberal democracy, certainly in the way it was approached, let's say, had a big role in where we are now in Afghanistan.
Any final takeaways and recommendations, calls for action?
The call for action to everybody that's here is continue to keep the issue of human rights, minority rights, and women's rights in Afghanistan central to everything that you do. That's in particular your research, your advocacy, and your programming. If we focus on just practical, pragmatic steps, thinking that that's going to take us somewhere, it won't unless you really advocate for structural change at the higher level. And they both have to go hand in hand if we want to actually see some sort of sustainable change in Afghanistan. So I would say let's keep that central in our work. Thank you.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, final thought is that, you asked a question about instrumentalization. I think looking at Afghanistan in the absence of active conflict as peace is missing the forest for the trees, and because the actual struggle for the women of Afghanistan is for liberation. And liberation isn't just about absence of conflict. Liberation is about the actualization of their human rights. And that's a struggle that women face everywhere in the world, and all disenfranchised people face everywhere in the world. Liberation is a different thing from an imposition of, national security agenda.
Just on what Ms. Safi has said, I echo that for sustainable change, especially in terms of women's rights and women's condition in the country, there should be top-bottom, bottom-top approach. And the focus should be on both. I mean, we cannot only, there should be, of course, people-centric when the time is not ready, but meanwhile, it should not be, the top-bottom approach shouldn't be neglected, that there should be constant work on that. The only thing which I want to add is including women, I think it was said before, including women in hard political discussions and hard politics. Women shouldn't be only a discussion of the side meetings, as Ms. Safi said also. Women should be the part of the hard security discussion. They should be the part of the economic development discussion. They should be the part of the hard politics, real politics discussion. That is where I think we need at this point more. And women, if we are, if we want to have a meaningful participation of women, so that participation at all aspects should be inclusive, and women should be at the major real political discussion.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Ms. Rina Amiri for joining us earlier, and our wonderful panelists for this incredible discussion, and of course for our audience for joining us today. I want to give a special shout out and thanks to the research team that conducted this in Afghanistan, which I know is incredibly difficult. I can't emphasize enough how incredibly proud we are of Afghan civil society that has been working under very difficult situation and has figured out how to kind of adapt and work to this new environment. And I think just to echo what Rina mentioned earlier in terms of the Afghans we invest in today will reflect the Afghanistan that we see tomorrow. And I think all of us support the efforts of civil society and women's rights organizations to make sure that this isn't just a side conversation, but it's very central to what happens next in Afghanistan. Thank you, and please join me in.
Thank you. Thank you.